Let me check to be sure that things are.
Okay.
There. Okay. Yeah.
All right. I think that we are good. So, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Today, we're going to cover some key invasive species to be on lookout and find out ways to help prevent their spread. My name is Emma Lorusso, and I'm the project director at the Androscoggin Valley Soil and Water Conservation District. And we're joined here with us, Colleen Teerling, who is the Forest Entomologist with the Maine Forest Service. Super excited to have her here joining us today, and also really excited that all of you are here to listen. As we go along, if you have any questions that pop up, feel free to type them in the chat, and I will keep track of them and have Colleen answer them as we go. We'll probably take a break after each insect and give a little time for some questions. If you have specific questions for specific insects or pests. So, and then afterwards, we'll have a Q&A session, so there'll be plenty of time to answer questions. So let's get started. This forest pest outreach program is made possible through a grant from the Maine Department of Ag, Conservation and Forestry, and is funded in part by the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. So really excited to be able to offer a free program for you guys. And we really thank those organizations for making that possible for us to do that. So to get started, we have to define what makes something invasive, right? We have invasive species in our waters and on our lands here in Maine. Common examples are variable milfoil and northern pike in our lakes and in our ponds. And we have green crabs along the coast. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with the Asiatic bittersweet, that vines that climb in our trees, in our forests, and in our yards. These invasive species are not naturally found in Maine and cause more harm to our environment, our economy, and our health than any benefits that they might provide to us. They outcompete Maine's native plants and animals for resources and can also damage food sources and habitats for other natives. So what actually does non-native mean? It means not from this continent and after the last ice age. So we're going to talk about pests that have been here for quite a long time, but that doesn't mean that they naturalize in these habitats. And then they're very opportunistic. They spread effectively. They often habitate places where natives find it difficult to thrive in. So just because it's a pest doesn't necessarily mean that it's an invasive pest. The differences between native and invasive pests is that native pests have natural checks and balances to their populations rather. Our native species have their own pests. Our native species, like our trees and our plants, have some defenses against these native pests. And those pests also have their own predators. They have their own parasites. All of those things help to knock down the populations. And then the pest populations themselves have highs and lows. But unfortunately, invasive pests rarely have any of these environmental controls in place. This allows them to spread and increase in numbers, and unfortunately, until the host collapses. So what does that really mean? So what? Well, Benjamin Franklin once said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So in order to slow the spread of invasive species, we have to band together as residents, businesses, municipalities, government agencies, all hopefully taking preventative action against these pests. They can do things like checking shipments of goods by land or by sea, following quarantines by federal or state guidelines for movement of plants and wood products, and supporting field monitoring and surveying efforts. We can also check and clean recreational equipment and vehicles, and also just be aware of our natural surroundings. So what makes you concerned about invasive forest pests? You can type it in the chat if you'd like. I think that the loss of native species is what concerns me the most about invasives. Yeah, totally. Loss of biodiversity, forest resilience, damage to native plants, totally.
One of the things that I'm concerned about is that as you lose native species, native trees, what comes in are often invasive plants.
Right,
so
exactly.
The whole ecosystem.
Yeah, Jennifer, I am concerned about it being too late to stop things. Yeah, totally. So it seems like we're all already on the same page, right?
Do you want me to go forward?
Yeah, I think we're ready.
Okay.
And so we've seen our forest damaged by invasive pests and diseases before. Things like chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, and gypsy moth have all affected us, our forests that we've seen. For me, chestnut blight is the one that really hits the hardest because of how different our forests look today, how different the chestnut tree looks today. And this is all due to human intervention. 130 years ago, the landscape across the East Coast looked vastly different. We had giant chestnut trees, some comparable to sequoias that we find out west. And chestnuts were a huge staple in food dishes for both Native Americans and also settlers. And chestnut is a very hard, strong, fast-growing wood. So we built our houses with it, barns, railroad ties, telephone poles. So the chestnut provided us with food, shelter, infrastructure, and dominated the overstory. Chestnut blight was accidentally introduced and ran rampant through the East Coast. And in only 40 years, every chestnut tree was gone or reduced to just a shrub. Now, there's at least one invasive forest pest threat for all of Maine's species of trees. To prevent the loss of our forests and the economic, recreational, environmental impacts that would come with it, we have to take measures to protect Maine's forest from insects and diseases that it can't really fight alone.
Hang on. Hang on. It's not. There we go.
And then, right now we're going to talk about who is already here in Maine. We already have many invasive forest pests that are harming our trees, including winter moth, emerald ash borer, brown-tailed moth, hemlock woolly adelgid, the elongated hemlock scale, and beech leaf disease. And all of these are impacting our forest industry, human health, and our favorite recreational activities or recreational spots. Now I'm going to pass it over to Colleen Teerling, who is, as I said before, Forest Entomologist with the Maine Forest Service. And she's going to talk more about these invasive pests that we find that are already found in Maine and some management updates. Thanks so much, Colleen.
Okay. So I'm going to start off talking about winter moth. Winter moth is a little caterpillar. It comes from Europe. You can see it here on maple leaf. and it's been eating holes in it, and you can see it's basically one of the little inchworms. There are a lot of native inchworms as well, but this is one of the invasive inchworms. It has a fairly wide host range. It'll feed on oaks and maples are some of the big ones, but apples, ashes, cherries, blueberries, and so it becomes an agricultural pest as well as a forest pest, and a pest of the urban forest. And it feeds really early in the season, even when the leaves are still in the bud. And so it can cause a lot of damage really early on. It has spread. It's spread it's in Nova Scotia, but it's also in Massachusetts, and for us, it's spread up the coast from Massachusetts. And it has moved fairly well along the coast of Maine for an insect that the female doesn't have any wings. So you can see a picture of the male here, which looks like the standard little beigey moth, really indistinct, or indistinguishable from most other little beigey moths. But here is the female, and it looks almost like a mosquito without any wings. It just is, it has basically no wings. It does not fly anywhere. So when this insect moves, if it moves on its own, it's with the caterpillars that will spin a silk thread and just blow in the wind. But it's human beings that move it around primarily. And we know that it came to Maine from Massachusetts, and it almost certainly came from people who had second homes along the coast, and they brought plantings of trees from underneath their infested trees in Massachusetts, brought them up here. And this insect spends the vast majority of its life in the soil, pupating. So it's called the winter moth, and it flies usually around Thanksgiving is when we start to see it. It will fly at nights, and you get big flights of moths coming to your lights at night. It's probably the winter moth. And so the males will fly, they will find the females that are wingless, and so they're on the trees, and they will mate with the females, and the females will lay their eggs on the trees. The eggs hatch really early in the spring, and they feed very early for a relatively short period of time in the spring, and then they drop down to the soil, and they pupate in the soil. And they're in the soil from May, June, July, August, September, October, November. So that's like seven months of the year that they're down in the soil. If they're in the soil, you will not see them because they cover themselves with dirt, and they look exactly like a little piece of dirt. And so this is how they get moved around. If somebody digs up some hostas underneath their maple tree in an infested area and takes them up to their summer home up in the coast, or they send them to their sister-in-law in Bangor, there you go. You've just moved this wingless insect that doesn't move very far on its own. You just moved it hundreds of miles, and so that's how it got here, and that's probably how it's moving along the coast. Caterpillars can hitchhike on vehicles, but primarily it's the movement of soil. There's a native species that looks very similar to it called the Bruce spanworm, and they can actually even interbreed. But the Bruce spanworm is not a pest to the same degree that the winter moth is. This insect can actually kill trees. And here we have some pictures of trees that are defoliated. You know, a good healthy oak tree is a big mature tree. It can get defoliated early in the spring, and it will grow back its leaves. And it'll be okay. It'll stress the tree out a bit, but it can do that. But if it gets hit year after year after year, defoliated every year, it can be killed. Also, if it gets defoliated once in the spring by this insect, and then maybe it gets hit later by Lymatria dispar, formerly known as gypsy moth, or some of the other native species that we have, it can't handle being defoliated twice in a year because it just doesn't have enough resources to get defoliated, grow a new set of leaves, get defoliated again. It just doesn't have enough to grow a new set of leaves again. So we have seen when this was at its worst, we saw that winter moth caused the death of just whole stands of oak trees, big healthy oak trees. But unlike almost every invasive species I work with, this is a good news story, which makes me so happy. I am a geek and things, interesting things make me happy. But this is an insect where we have a really, really good parasite. There's a little parasitic fly, and this fly, being a really smart little fly, will emerge up in the spring, and it will go smelling out leaves that have been fed on by the winter moth, and it will lay its eggs on the leaf right near an area that's been fed on by the winter moth. Then as the winter moth continues to eat, it will eat those eggs. Then when the winter moth drops down to the soil, that's when those eggs hatch in the gut of the winter moth, and the parasite grows inside of that pupating winter moth, eats it out from the inside, which is a really gruesome fate for the winter moth, but is really good for from our point of view. And we have been releasing these winter moths wherever we can along the coast of Maine. Sizenus alga, this is a picture of the fly. Sizenus albicans is its name. Two Light State Park in Portland was one of the first places where we released this insect, and we're getting 30% parasitism already. And South Portland, we only released a few years ago, and already we're up to close to 10% parasitism. So this insect is just working way, way faster than forest biological control usually does. When we talk about biological control in the forest, we're usually talking about, well, maybe in 50 years it will take effect. But here it's happening in just a few years. So this is really amazing. One caveat is, though, that this parasite alone can only cause about 40% mortality. The rest of the mortality happens when it's in the ground. Remember I told you that it spends about 8 months of the year as a pupa in the ground? And so things like ground voles, little predators, shrews and voles, all the ground beetles and rove beetles, all those little predators in the soil, those are the ones that are really important in doing that other 60% of mortality. So those ground predators on their own, they can't do it. But when we put this biological control in, this Sizenus albicans, it drops the population low enough that the ground predators can finish them off. And so that partnership between the two is really important. And so that's also something to keep in mind. If you're one of those people that likes to have an absolutely pristine lawn and you're spraying it with pesticides every year, you will just never get control of winter moth, because we need to have those ground dwelling, those really, really important ground dwelling predators. And these are just some of the areas that we've been releasing the biological control. We have to we can't go out and buy this biological control. Nobody else rears it for us. What we have to actually do is we go out into the forest where we have released biocontrol in the past, when we collect all sorts of caterpillars, and then we rear them up and we take the predators, the parasites out from them and release them in another area. So we're finding it kind of hard to find winter moth recently because there's been some sort of disease out there, and so we haven't had a lot of biological control to release. But that's something that we're working on, and hopefully we will get a little bit more funding to help us do that. But every spring we go out and collect thousands and thousands of winter moths so that we can rear them up and get biological control agents out of them. And does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, there was a question
about before we roll that off. Feel free to just unmute yourself if you want to, and just ask them.
Deb Perkins asked, where is this fly native to? Is it native to the Northeast?
No, so this fly is native to Europe, which is where the winter moth comes from. And so we had to look really carefully. We look very carefully before we bring in any biological control, and we test it very rigorously to be sure that it will not attack anything else. Remember I told you that there was Bruce spanworm, which is so closely related to winter moth that they can actually interbreed. But this parasite is so specific that will only attack the winter moth, and it doesn't even attack the Bruce spanworm. So we're really, really careful, because in the past we've done really stupid things with biological control and gone over to, say, Europe and just gathered everything that attacked, say, Lymantria dispar or something else, and just came and dumped it in our forest. willy-nilly without any regard to what else it might do and what else it might affect. And so we do not do that anymore. We've gotten a lot smarter, and we're very careful to be sure that something will only attack what we want it to attack, and that it would rather die than attack something else.
I've got a question as well. You mentioned the Bruce spanworm and the winter moth mating, but you said that they're not of worry. Like, we're not worried about their offspring, their generation one not being an issue. How is that possible? Like, I'm curious about them two mating and it not being an issue for our.
So Bruce spanworm tends to be more inland and north. And so they're kind of geologically separated, or sorry, geographically separated. And so they're separated both geographically and somewhat in time. So they can interbreed, but they don't that much. And so at this time, that's not a big concern, just because it sort of is just incidental when they do interbreed.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay, well, we can go on to emerald ash borer, which is not nearly as happy a story as winter moth. Emerald ash borer is a wood boring insect, and what it does is it will lay its eggs on the bark, and the insect goes underneath the bark, and it will tunnel just underneath the bark, and it essentially girdles a tree from the inside. It eats the entire cambium layer, which is the living layer of the trees between the heartwood and the bark, and kills trees. One of the ways of looking for it is looking for woodpecker feeding, and crown dieback, epicormic shoots on the trees. Bark will split when you and if sometimes when it splits, you can see these galleries underneath the tree or underneath the bark. Where is it? I'd like to say this is where it is, but this thing moves so fast that this map is already out of date. So we have a small infestation up north that we actually found first, way up in the corner. It was actually started in New Brunswick, right on the shores of the St. John River. And so there's one infestation that's sort of growing on both the Canadian side and our side of the river. And then later we found it down south. Down south, it is spreading very quickly for a number of reasons. One, the southern infestation is basically the leading edge of this massive front that's just coming in from all of eastern US. And so there's just massive numbers. Also up north, it's just a small point infestation at this point in time, so it's growing much more slowly. Also up north, there are basically it's a 2-year generation, or 2 years for a single generation. So the population is growing a little more slowly. Down south where it's warmer, although the infestation may start out with the EAB taking 2 years to complete its life cycle, as soon as the trees start to get stressed and the population builds up, it goes to a 1-year life cycle. So if you look at this map over here, we actually have EAB up here, just around the edge of the northern blue area here, which is an emergency order. The crosshatch bit is the quarantine region, and the area in blue is an emergency order. We just found it in gray, which is right close to the eastern border of Cumberland County as well. We found that about a week and a half ago. So this is an insect that's constantly, the situation is very fluid and constantly changing, and this is expanding as much as we try to slow it down. And you know, quarantines do help to slow it down, but it's not an insect that we will be able to stop. One of the things to look for is this woodpecker feeding, and this is a perfect time of year to look for woodpecker feeding. The woodpeckers that we're talking about are primarily the smaller woodpeckers like downy woodpeckers and hairy woodpeckers, as well as things like nuthatches. And they will feed on the emerald ash borer that are overwintering underneath the bark, because they get really big and fat over winter, and there's good eating in an infested tree, and birds are, they're smart and they learn where the good trees are, and birds can clean out like something like 90% of the emerald ash borer in a tree. The thing is, they can't get every tree. They tend to focus in on a tree that they know is good and just take out all the emerald ash borer from that tree. So early on in an infestation, woodpeckers are a really important source of biological control. They do actually keep the numbers down early on in an infestation. But the other thing that's really important with woodpeckers is that they help us find emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer is underneath the bark. It's really hard for us to see it. And so it helps to have woodpeckers on our side. They can find it easier than we do. And so if you're out in the woods in the winter, look for, come on, look for this feeding. And then if if the tree is on your property and you can peel back the bark a little bit, you may be able to see the galleries just underneath the bark. And as I said, it's the smaller woodpeckers that feed on the overwintering larvae. So yeah, keep your eyes open. This is the perfect time of year to look for woodpecker feeding. I'm really, really happy to have woodpeckers as our allies, because there are a lot that aren't finding it than we are. These are the larvae that you will see underneath the bark. If you find something underneath the bark of trees and aren't sure what it is, because we don't expect you to be able to identify insects, if you can take pictures, take a picture of the gallery, because that's very, very distinctive. Or if you do see insects, you can take pictures of them. The insects have these very distinctive bell-shaped segments. The galleries are sort of a continuous S shape. If you see galleries underneath the bark of ash trees and they've got Y intersections or T intersections, or they've got dead ends where it looks like they go forward and then they double back and go in a different direction, that's not emerald ash borer. Emerald ash borer has a very continuous, sort of sinuous look to it, the galleries. When you see when the infestation gets really high and the population is high, it's a little harder to see that nice continuous S-shaped gallery. But if you see something underneath the bark, you see galleries underneath the bark of an ash tree, take a picture, send it in to us, because I can usually identify something just from a picture. Girdle trap trees are one of our better ways of finding emerald ash borer. We do a lot of things. We do purple traps, we do green funnel traps, we do biosurveillance. There's just a whole lot of things we do. None of them are perfect, but trap trees are one of our more sensitive tools. And this is where we will take the bark off of a tree here in the spring. As you can see, that tree stays alive all summer because we haven't cut into the heartwood, so it can still transport water up, but the nutrient flow is compromised. And so it is stressed in a particular way that makes it very attractive to emerald ash borer. And by very attractive, I don't mean it brings them in from miles away, but if EAB are in the surrounding trees, it will actually draw them out of the surrounding trees, protecting the surrounding trees for at least for a short while. And they will tend to come to that tree. And then in the fall, we cut down that tree and we peel it and look for any of those galleries, any signs of emerald ash borer. If you have a woodlot and are interested in being part of this, please send me an email, because we have this network all throughout the state of landowners, small woodlot owners, land trusts, towns and cities. Sometimes we'll put out trap trees on either on the city streets, town streets, or in the woodlots, the city forests. The more trap trees that we have throughout the state, the better our chance is of finding EAB. And we have found that the trap trees usually find EAB a couple of years before we start to see any visible signs like woodpecker feeding or some of those other things. So it's one of the fairly good early warning signs. So yeah, give me an email if you're at all interested. And the trap trees also we find a lot of our biological control sites we find with trap trees, which is kind of useful. So there are 3 tiny little parasites that attack emerald ash borer. So if you think of emerald ash borer here, you could probably fit about 2 emerald ash borer end to end across a penny. So it's a pretty small insect. And these parasites are even smaller. They're teeny tiny. 2 of them are parasites of the larvae, those 2 larger ones. And they will lay their eggs. They feel exactly where the EAB is underneath the bark, and they can lay their eggs through the bark right on emerald ash borer. And the 3rd one, that really tiny one, is actually a parasite of the eggs. These insects will probably not protect the current generation of trees that are up now. Although there is some evidence now that they are protecting right at release sites, that they are protecting the smaller, the younger trees. But the hope is that, once the main wave of EAV goes through and a lot of the ash trees will die, the population of EAV will drop down. And the hope is at that point in time that the population of these insects will have increased. Because there are millions and millions of billions probably of EAB out there. And we are releasing these parasites by the thousands because they're hard to rear. And so we need to give them some time to build up. And so as I mentioned, most of our biological control sites were found with girdle trap trees. So we're definitely encouraging people, if they have good stands of ash on their property and want to be considered for biological control, if you want to be part of the girdle trap tree network, that may be a good thing. So we've released biocontrol up north, and we are starting now. We're finished the releases in those 2 sites, and we are starting to look to see if we can recover parasites. Have they established, and are they reproducing? Down south, we released them this year, and we'll be releasing 1 more year next year, and then after that, we'll start looking to see if they're established there as well. It's generally important. We try to encourage people to not. We tell people, don't kiss your ash goodbye. We don't want to get rid of ash on the landscape. It's really, really important to keep ash on the landscape because ash is a really important part of our forests. It's important ecologically in a lot of ways. And so keeping small diameter on the landscape may help slow down the spread of EAB, because when an EAB emerges from a tree, if it doesn't find an ash nearby, it will fly for miles until it dies or finds an ash. Whereas if there's another ash tree just 20 feet away, that's maybe as far as it goes in a year. And keeping the younger ash on the landscape will also keep ashes and ash seed on the landscape as long as possible to help us reseed this ash forest as biological control takes effect. And also we need to have ash trees left on the landscape. If all the ash get cut down, we can't release biological control. And so we need ash on the landscape for biocontrol to be effective, for it to even happen. And there is actually resistance especially in white ash, a little bit less in green ash, and sadly, brown ash or black ash, which is what is so culturally important to the natives and is involved in basket making and in so many parts of their culture. That species has very little resistance. But there's a significant amount of ash or resistance in the white ash trees. And so it's important to keep ash on the landscape. Check on time here. And another reason just to keep ash on the landscape as long as possible is that there's a lot we don't know. And so keeping ash there gives us options. So we strongly encourage people to not go in and say, oh, all the ash is going to die, so therefore let's just cut it all down now before it gets here. It is really important to keep ash there. So are there questions before we go into brown-tailed moth? Any questions about ash, emerald ash borer?
I have a question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So the trap trees, after you cut them down, what are you doing with any insects that you find in there?
So we cut it down. If the trees are clean, it's no problem. We actually can send them home with people to use as firewood if they want,
Yeah,
or
of
we'll give it
course.
to a firewood bank. But if it does have emerald ash borer in it, then we're sure to burn it right away, burn it that winter. So we peel trees in the fall, and so then we have people that can burn them before spring, before
Cool.
flight season starts.
Yep, of course.
Okay, brown tail moth. This story just keeps getting worse and worse. Brown tail moth is an insect I absolutely loathe because I am so very allergic to it. That makes my life miserable. So brown tail moth is another insect like winter moth that comes from Europe. It's a caterpillar. But unlike winter moth, it is a fuzzy caterpillar, and it has really toxic hairs. Those toxic hairs give a reaction to many people that's very similar to poison ivy. So if you think about microscopic hairs floating through the air, it's like invisible floating poison ivy. And it is spreading. It used to be in a fairly small area along the coast, and it is spreading now. We're finding it throughout many parts of the state, which is kind of a scary thought. This is one of those insects that is getting worse and spreading, and climate change is definitely not helping us with that. It's getting worse and worse as we have longer falls and long warm summers and falls and early springs. So where is it? As I said, the population and the areas that have been defoliated have just been increasing and increasing and increasing. It's throughout Androscoggin, Kennebec, Knox, and Waldo are the 4 counties that are the most heavily affected. There are a couple of pathogens. There's a fungus and there is a virus that are fairly widespread, or were fairly widespread in the population of brown tail moth. But they do depend on weather, and particularly the fungus. That when we have cold, wet springs, and the caterpillars tend to come back and sort of huddle together all together in their webs at night on the colder, wetter weather, and they spread these pathogens to each other. And also the cool, wet springs just allows this fungus to take off. And so when we have cool, wet springs, the population can really crash locally in some areas. Unfortunately, the last 2 years we've had hot, dry springs, and we're just not really seeing these pathogens pretty much anywhere at all. And so I am really, really hoping for a cold, wet spring this spring. But who's to say? That's not something we have any control over. If you go to our website, there's a lot of information, including our survey map, which we are working on right now for 2022. What we do for our survey map is we go out and we just have people driving pairs all along the roads, looking at the tops of the trees. Let me see, do I have? So I should mention that right now, at this point in time, the caterpillars are overwintering. The young caterpillars are overwintering in tiny little webs in the tops of the trees. So they're not great big sloppy webs. They're just tight little webs about the size of 1 or 2 leaves. If they're really big, maybe 3 or 4 leaves that are silked together. And a good way to see them is at this time of year to stand with your back to the sun on a sunny day, and the sun will reflect off of that bright white, and I'll show you that bright white silk, and you'll be able to see them. And they're at the tips of the branches generally, not down in the crotches of the branches, but right on the tips. And now is the time to go out and look for it. We do surveys that will sort of tell you in general where the high risk areas are. And this is from last year. you can see that there are some areas, you know, where it wasn't last year. Some of those areas are worse this year. And if you go to our website, within probably a month or so, month or two, we'll have that up for this year's survey. But you know, now is the time to go out and just look at where the trees on your property and in your community to see where brown-tailed moth is. I go out to see, you know, where is brown-tailed? Where can I safely go for a walk in the spring or the summer, if anywhere, because I'm so highly allergic to it. I just also want to mention that February is brown-tailed moth awareness month, and there's a lot of resources on our website, so go take a look at that. Lots of frequently asked questions and how to mitigate damage. This is a time of year that if you have small trees, you want to prune out the webs from your trees. If you have great big trees, if you have trees right near where you live, by your doors, by your houses, you may want to talk to an arborist about treating those trees or cutting them out with they do cherry pickers. They can cut trees, webs out of big trees. It's not a cheap thing to do, but you want to talk to an arborist now. If you wait till the spring, they will tell you, I can guarantee you that they will not be able to do anything about it, because one, by the time you're starting to notice the itch, it's just too late to do anything about it. So go out and look at your trees now and make a plan about what to do. That is a very, very brief, I could talk for hours about brown-tailed moth, but are there any questions about brown-tail?
I'm cutting out any, during any time of year, just cutting them out. My father used to burn the caterpillar bunches, just like on our own property. Sorry, not sorry.
Yes.
But like, is there any, so you've talked about all of the biological controls. Is there any biological control that we know for brown-tailed moth negatory? Okay.
Well, so there's not really in the past, because this is an insect that came over in the late 1800s. And so back in those days, they went to Europe and just brought everything they could and dumped them into the forest. The same as this was about the same time as Lymantria dispar. And so there were things that were brought over. There were generalist parasites that were brought over that are in our forests, but they don't seem to be really doing a great job, especially along the coast. They may be doing, they may be helping a little bit inland to help keep the populations down, and the fungus and virus may help a little bit more along the coastal areas, but there doesn't seem to be that much. And when we go to Europe to look for parasites, they're all generalist parasites, and so we can't bring any others over, which is, we can't bring over something that can attack a whole bunch of different things.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
So, and yeah, I should mention, if you clip the webs out, don't just drop them onto the ground, because in the spring, these caterpillars are really, really good at wandering around until they find a tree, and they'll just make their way back up the tree. So when you clip out the webs in the winter, you can burn them, which could be really satisfying if you've been really miserable in past years. Or if you're feeling a little less vengeful, you can just dump them in a bucket of soapy water for 24, 48 hours, and that will take care of them. Okay, Hemlock Woolly Adelgid. Hemlock Woolly Adelgid is, this one actually, unlike some of the others which have been from Europe, this one is from Asia. And it is related to aphids that you find on your roses and things like that. It's one of those, it's got piercing, sucking mouth parts. It sticks its mouth parts into the tree, sucks the juices out of the twigs, and causes the needles to drop off and eventually for the twigs to die. This is one of the insects that is somewhat it is significantly affected by winter cold weather. And so in the past, Maine has been somewhat protected by this. As our winters become less severe, shorter, not as cold, this winter possibly being a little bit of an exception. We are not getting the protection that we have had in the past. And so this is one of those insects that with climate change and global warming is, was probably going to work its way inland and further north. This is an insect that most of its life, it spends its life attached to the twig with it, because once it's put its mouth parts into the twig, it cannot take them out because its mouth parts are longer than the insect itself. So it's stuck there for the rest of its life. But it will lay eggs. So underneath every one of those little woolly sacs is a female, and she will lay her eggs underneath there. She will lay about 300 eggs per generation. We've got 2 generations a year, so that's a lot of increase. And she'll lay her eggs. The eggs will hatch into what's called crawlers. And you can see the crawlers will wander around, and those are when they are, that's when, so from about March to the middle of August, those crawlers are present, and they're really tiny, they're mobile. And if you work in areas that are infested, or you're walking through areas that are infested, you'll get them on your hair, your hat, your clothes, your machinery, if you have an arborist coming in to work. And so we really discourage people from working in hemlock trees that are infested from March to August, to do that in the fall and the winter. And you can see, if you look here, there's this tiny, you see my cursor, this tiny little black insect. That's a crawler that has settled. And so it's now no longer a crawler, it's a nymph. So they're very small. And so the thing to remember with hemlock woolly adelgid is that March through August is when the crawlers are present from those 2 generations. And that's when it's so very, very easy to transmit and start a new infestation. All adelgids in North America are females. And so all it takes is one adelgid to get transported to a new tree, and you started a new infestation. They don't need to mate. They live only on hemlock trees. As I said, they're covered by this woolly wax, and they live on the undersides of the twigs and the bases of the needles. And where are they? So this blue area is not necessarily the area where they all are. This is the quarantine area. And just these little green dots is where we were doing some survey along the outside of the quarantine area. But if you can see, if you look closely, you can see the crosshatch towns. That's where we found hemlock woolly adelgid. So it's primarily along the coastal ranges of the towns, going in 2 or 3 towns. Up as far as Bar Harbor, we found it a couple of years ago. However, right in here around Sebago Lake on Fry Island, we found where somebody had accidentally introduced it there, and probably quite a while ago, and it had spread there, and it has also spread to some of the shores of the lake as well. So we've got this sort of little cluster of hemlock woolly adelgid quite far inland for us. As I was talking about the crawlers there, those are what the crawlers look like. They're very tiny. If you can see, that's right at the base of the hemlock needle, so you can see how small they are. Another way to see how small they are, and this is a beach sheet, and I laid this underneath a branch of a hemlock that had hemlock woolly adelgid, and I just hit the branch with a stick, and it doesn't look like there's anything there other than some twigs and needles. You look closely, and there are thousands and thousands of tiny little crawlers there, almost invisible to the naked eye. If you've got good eyes, you can see them. Some people with older eyes, they need to use a hand lens to see them. So they're really small, and during that spring and summer period, as I said, it's really easy to transmit them around. Elongate hemlock scale is somewhat similar. It is again related to, it's at the same piercing sucking mouth parts, in similar family to the hemlock woolly adelgid. It has a wider host range. It feeds on hemlocks, but also firs and spruces. And it is actually on the undersides of the needles. and kind of makes the branches or the needles look kind of dirty. And when you look at it from a distance, you can kind of see this whiteness and dirtiness. When hemlock trees get hit by both adelgid and elongate hemlock scale, it really knocks out the trees a lot faster. So there is our biological control agents that we are releasing for this insect, but they are very limited. There are some that people can buy, and then others that you get from the federal government, but not in great numbers. And this is an insect that it will take years for the populations to build up, because if we release thousands of them, there are trillions of elongate or of emerald ash borer, of hemlock woolly adelgid out there, and so it will take a long time to control them. Are there any questions about the hemlock insects?
I guess, why is it more of a coastal thing, or is that because hemlocks are more seen down by the coast?
It's a coastal thing because our winters are protecting us inland at this point. So the winters are milder along the coast, and so the modeling suggests that as winters get milder, this insect will move north and will move inland.
Okay.
But at this point in time, our winters are still giving us some protection.
Thank you.
And then we can go on to a brand new, for us, brand new disease that we found last year or this year. Geez, years are all blending together. Might have been this year. We found called beech leaf disease. This is an odd little thing, and we don't even really know that much about it. We do know that it's associated with a nematode, which is a tiny little microscopic worm. And anytime we find beech leaf disease, we find this little microscopic worm. We assume that this worm causes the disease. We have no idea how it spreads. Does it get spread on the feet of birds, or in the digestive system of birds, or how does it move around? How does something that is so tiny and microscopic and is inside the leaves, lives inside the buds, how does it move around? We don't know. So what we do see, and what we need people to look for, because we just discovered this in Maine, is if you look at these areas in between the veins on the beech leaves, on a normal healthy leaf, it all looks very uniform. But if you see these dark patches in between the veins, that is beech leaf disease. And so looking up into the sky, as with the light shining down through the leaves, makes them very easy to identify. Eventually, you will get the whole crown will become thin, and trees can die. Younger trees can die within a year or two. Older trees take a longer time to die. It attacks all species of the beech tree, unlike beech bark disease, which attacks which attacks our American beech. This attacks the European and Asian species as well. And the leaves will become leathery and distorted and puckered, and basically the photosynthetic capability is reduced, and the leaves will drop, and the tree will die. This is something that in the past, it started out in the Ohio area, and it was more recently been found towards the east, and then this last year we found it up here all throughout sort of central area of Maine, and a lot of areas sort of south central. And we'd love for people to keep an eye open for it. We've done a lot of surveying. It's relatively easy to see. You can even see it in the winter because beech sometimes hang on to their leaves. You can even see it in the brown leaves. You can see it on the leaves on the ground, although it's probably a little easier to see it on the leaves that are on the tree. But do please keep an eye open for this, because we don't know exactly where all it is in Maine. You can see, you know, in purple here, counties where we have found it, and you can see, you know, sort of Knox and Waldo, and I think up into Penobscot, we found it. These are the areas, but there could well be more out there that we just haven't found yet, because there are relatively few of us. It's a big forest out there. So any questions about that? I am not a pathologist, but I will answer any questions that I can. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a few things that are not yet in Maine, at least not that we know of, but are things that are on our borders, or that certainly worry us. The first thing is Asian longhorn beetle. Asian longhorn beetle is a wood borer, and unlike emerald ash borer, which is just underneath the bark of the tree, this insect burrows deep into the wood. It will chew out a little egg niche on the bark and lay its eggs there, and the eggs will bore into the wood. It will sort of crawl around just underneath the bark for a while, and then it heads deep into the wood and tunnels deep throughout the wood. And when it's inside the forest, when it's inside the tree, there's really nothing you can do to, you can't spray the tree, you can't do anything like that, because it's protected deep inside the dead part of the wood, the heartwood, where nothing penetrates. And it will spend a couple of years there in the wood, and then it emerges out chewing about a dime-sized exit hole. Basically, it's about the size of a maple tap, and it's a perfectly round hole that it will cut. And the adults are around from July to October or so. We've got here a picture of the male and the female. The male is a little bit smaller, has really, really long antennae, longer than its body, almost twice as long as its body. The female's antennae are not quite as long compared to its body, her body. Bright, shiny insects, and they have a fairly wide host range: maple, birch, elm, poplar, willow, horse chestnut. And how they damage the tree is that boring underneath the bark and in the wood stops nutrients from moving throughout the tree, and can eventually just weaken and kill the tree. But it also will weaken the branches because of all of these holes that are just, you know, the branches are riddled with holes. You get a winter storm, a snowstorm, or a windstorm, and all of a sudden trees are just falling apart and crashing everywhere and breaking down power lines, and definitely a huge issue, particularly in the urban landscape. And you can see here the little egg niche where the female will chew through the outer bark to lay her eggs, just to sort of give her larvae a little bit of a head start in chewing under the bark. Some of the signs to look for is that perfectly round hole, about the size of a tap for maple syrup. And you can often see at the base of the tree frass, which is basically just wood shavings and insect poop. And so as they're tunneling this, they'll push out all this wood shavings. And if you see that at the base of the tree, it's worthwhile to look closer to see if you can find that those little egg niches or any of the exit holes. And if you're cutting down trees or sawing up, you know, pruning off branches, and if you see this tunneling throughout the branches or the trunk, that's also a good sign to look for. This is basically the only way to really control this insect, is to cut down trees that are infested. And because we don't always know which tree is infested, and this is a regulated pest, AVIS will come in and they will just, you know, have to cut down all of the trees that are hosts in an area which is known to be heavily infested. This is just a before and after picture. It's just really distressing. The good news, as such as it is with Asian longhorn beetle, is that if we catch it early, it can actually be eradicated. And there are several places here listed in green where they actually did eradicate it. They found it early on down in Boston. Somebody, you know, took a course like this, and, you know, how to identify various insects, and they went home and they looked out and said, they were right across from the big arboretum, the Morton Arboretum. They said that kind of looks like Asian longhorn beetle holes. And so they went in. They only had to cut down 6 trees, and that was it. They caught it. They nipped it in the bud. And unlike other places where they spent millions and millions of dollars, this was just something small, and they were able to say, you know, this is actually eradicated. They monitored for however many years it took for them to say, you know, yes, it is eradicated. So this is an insect that can be eradicated, but we need to keep our eyes open for it, and get it early. How it spreads? In firewood, because this is an insect that's deep in the woods, deep in the wood, and it can move so easily in firewood. There are a number of insects that look very similar to it. Asian longhorn beetle here on the left, large insect, very shiny. And that's one of the things that stands out to people. When it's alive, its feet sometimes look a little bit blue, but it's very shiny. It has very big, very distinct spots. The citrus longhorn beetle is very similar, but the difference is it has a little spot right here where the wings are attached to the body. This over here is on the right is our native white-spotted Sawyer. It also has this spot right here where the wings attach to the body. And it is more of a matte finish. It's kind of got its wing, its elytra, and there's the other parts of its body are a little more pitted and not that bright, shiny kind of patent leather bowling ball shiny finish on it. And its spotting tends to be a little bit more mottled, a little less distinct, not the big bright spots of the two invasive species, citrus longhorn beetle, which we don't think we have here, but that we did have a scare a few years ago, as well as Asian longhorn beetle. Oh, come on, computer. Okay. Oh, yes, right. That's just showing you the spots. And Asian longhorn beetle does not have that little white spot where the wings attach to the body, but the other two do. Asian longhorn beetle, any questions? Shall I plow on?
I have a question. So,
Yeah.
For the places that are listed as having eradicated, how can they, with confidence, say that it wouldn't come back, or, you know, something like that?
So in places where they have eradicated it, they, for it's either 3 or 5 years, do some really intensive monitoring around those areas. And it's sort of like, you know, if you have cancer and you check for it several years afterwards, and if you go for a number of years by being cancer free, you can say, okay, we're pretty sure you're cancer free. It's kind of like that. So, you know, it's not 100%,
an interesting analogy.
If they monitor it, if they monitor really intensively for those few years afterwards, they can say with a fair degree of confidence that we think it's gone.
Wow, that's awesome.
That it is gone.
Any other questions?
Okay, so spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly is, again, similar to things like the elongate hemlock scale and hemlock woolly adelgid. It's one of those piercing, sucking insects. It's one of the true bugs. It's actually a really spectacular insect. The younger life stages are fairly small and kind of, they're black with these bold white marks. And then the fourth nymphal stage, it just blossoms into this brilliant, large, very brilliant black and red, and black and white and red all over. And it's just, it's gorgeous, brilliant. You can't miss it. And then the adult is, when it has its wings down against its body, it looks almost a little bit like a moth or something like that. But when it opens up its wings, you can see this brilliant red under hind wings. There's one generation a year, and how it gets moved around is a couple of ways, but one is the egg masses. It overwinters as an egg mass. The egg mass looks sort of like mud or cement. Early on, like early in the winter, it's relatively easy to see. As the winter progresses, it tends to get very weathered, and it's a lot harder to see these covered egg masses. It feeds on hardwood trees and a lot of our woody crops. It has a huge host range. A fair number of forest trees, including walnut. Tree of heaven is one that it really prefers. Luckily for us in Maine, we don't have a lot of tree of heaven, because that's one of the invasive trees, and we'd like to not have it. But it attacks apple and it attacks cherry. If you like to drink beer and wine, you want to keep your eyes open for this insect, because it attacks grape and hops. It loves both of those too. And so that's one of the things, Joe, it just has a lot of really wide host range. They will suck the sap out of the tree. And one of the issues is that as they're sucking the sap out of the tree, like aphids and other insects, they will secrete this basically excrete the sugar solution, and that leads to sooty mold, and that can be a really a big issue. And the sooty mold can affect the trees and affect the crops as much as almost anything else, as well as just weakening the plants. There you can see an apple tree, what it would look like, and then just covered in the spotted lanternflies. The sooty mold will cover the fruit and make them unmarketable. These insects are really good hitchhikers. I don't know if we have another slide that says that, but yeah, where it is found, it's well established in Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, New York. They did find it in Massachusetts. In New Hampshire and in Maine, we have found egg masses. I don't know that it's established yet, but that's something that we certainly are looking for. In sort of coastal Maine, Freeport area, we know there were some trees that were brought in from Pennsylvania that had egg masses on them. We think the egg masses had already hatched before it got to Maine, but we're not entirely sure. We've been doing a lot of monitoring there and haven't found anything yet. But this is an insect that is highly mobile, spreads easily, will hitchhike on trucks and vehicles. Egg masses can be on almost anything, so the egg masses can be moved. But it will also just hitchhike on if you park your car in an area, under a tree and then drive north, you can bring it with you. We don't know yet how serious an issue this is going to be in Maine, just because some of the hosts are not as common. The hosts that it really likes are not as common up here, so we don't know how big of an impact it will have here, but it has the potential to have an impact. So as I said, yeah, it lays its eggs on pretty much any flat surface, and those eggs can be moved around easily. Vehicles, outdoor equipment, trees if they're brought in, and yeah, it's also a good hitchhiker. Any questions on this insect?
I recall seeing a video of somebody, and I believe I feel like it was out west, but maybe not. Maybe it was just south of Maine. And they were basically taking a water bottle. I've got my video on, but I don't. They were basically taking a water bottle and they were like sucking off them from a tree. And I was like, what are you doing? That's terrible. Oh my gosh. But how would you fully remove it from something like that, like a huge infestation? I literally watched somebody just like plucking them off in a video, and I was like, I don't understand why you're killing these things. They're beautiful. Learning about them now, obviously, I'm like, God, get rid of them. But
Yeah,
I
would say probably trying to pull them off one at a time is like spitting into the wind. It's not going to do you any good, I don't think. Maybe with a strong jet of water, you might be able to knock them down and then suck them up with a vacuum cleaner or something like that and stop back. I don't know. I don't think, there's so many of them, and the numbers get so high that unless maybe you have one rose bush that you loved or something like that, you might be able to protect it, or one shrub or tree in your yard. But I don't know how much good that would do. I honestly don't. Yeah.
Well, just learning about this, it makes me not dislike that person now, knowing what this thing is. At first, I was like, "Oh my gosh, no!"
He was trying. Yeah, they're they're like emerald ash borer. They're
beautiful,
gorgeous insect. They're spectacular, but they can be really destructive.
Yep.
And oak wilt. I think this is the last insect. Or no, last disease. So oak wilt is it's caused by a fungus, but this fungus is moved around by various beetles, and it's moved around by native beetles. And oak wilt is very common in the Midwest. It's moving eastwards. It's getting closer and closer to us. And that's one of the things that we're seriously concerned about, given how important oak trees are in our forest. There's a lot of different symptoms. I'll show you some of them. It can attack any size of oak tree, from the saplings right up to giant oak trees. And depending on the species of the oak tree, infections can it can actually kill a huge oak tree in a matter of a month, or in some species they're a little more resistant and they can hang on for years. So this picture here just shows you the fungal pad underneath the bark, and this fungus moves through the tree and kills it. One of the things that you will notice, one of the symptoms, is that the leaves turn brown early in the summer. So if all of a sudden the leaves are turning brown and falling in June or July, that's often a sign of oak wilt. The other thing that we often see is that the base of the leaf may stay green and the margins turn brown. And you can also see bark splitting, and other things, but those are sort of the main things. Basically, if you see an oak tree and it just suddenly the leaves turn brown and the tree looks like it's dying, and defoliating in the middle of the summer, that's oak wilt, or probably oak wilt. It gets moved in various ways. Let's see, I didn't mention that. So it does get moved in various ways. It can be moved with root grass. And that's why oak trees tend to have root grafts between any number of trees. And so you see an oak stand, and the fungus could just move from tree to tree to tree to tree through the roots, because all of these trees tend to have root grafts. And so whole stands of trees can die. Where it is now, it's widely spread throughout the Midwest, and they found it in New York in small patches, and they're fighting it there, and we hope that it doesn't move too much more to the east, but it's one of those things that we figure is going to get here at some point in time. How does it move? So the sap beetles will feed on the, especially on wounds, and will pick up the spores and then move to another tree and deposit the spores as they're feeding. And that's one of the ways that it gets moved. The other thing, as I mentioned, is root grafts. And the third way is just pruning during the growing season. And so what we've been discovering in places where this is prevalent is that they have to, try to get people to not cut trees, not prune trees during that growing season, May to July, to try to reduce wounding. And if you do create wounds like that, to cover them over with some some sort of paint treatment, so that you do not bring in the beetles to move the spores around. So basically, I think that's, as I said, I'm an entomologist, not a pathologist, but that's what I know about oak wilt. If you see any of these insects, definitely take note of where you see them, take pictures, send in pictures to bugwatch@maine.gov, and they will go to the person who is most responsible for each of these insects or diseases. We are a very small division, and there's not that many of us out in the woods, and so we really do rely on people like you guys who hear about these things to keep your eyes open. We would rather have 100 pictures that turn out to be something that's innocuous, rather than somebody ignoring something because they don't want to be a pest, or they don't, they're not sure what it is, and not taking a picture. We want you to send in pictures. Yeah, I think, do you want to take any more questions now, or would you like to,
Yeah, I think definitely would love to know. We had some questions that came in after we moved on from
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't we just open up for questions of any sort?
Yeah, so somebody asked that about what is it? Oh, brown tail. People have suggested wrapping tape around the bottom of oak trees to keep the caterpillar from going up the tree. Is there any value in that?
So that actually is more effective for winter moth. Remember, the winter moth, the female, doesn't have any wings. Brown tail moth, they have wings, they can fly, so that's not going to do anything for brown tail. The winter moth, if you have a tree that is somewhat isolated from other trees, you can do that wrapping, or if you wrap all of the trees in your yard, all of the host trees, that may help, because it will stop the females from climbing up as they they're pupating in the ground and they crawl up the tree. So that certainly may help for winter moth. If you are in a forest and the insects can just the young caterpillars can bring can spin these silk threads and then just blow in the wind to your tree, it's not going to protect them entirely, but it can help somewhat to protect them.
Any other questions that anybody had? Feel free to type them, or you can unmute yourself.
Yeah.
It's a lot of information, definitely.
There are a couple of other slides, I think. What you can do, probably the most important thing is just not moving firewood, talking to people about not moving firewood around. So many of these insects and diseases are caused by firewood, oak wilt is moved around with firewood. Asian longhorn beetle, emerald ash borer moved around in firewood. And so we do know that firewood moves insects. It's not something that's inert. It's not completely dead. There's a lot of living things left in them. And a study in New Hampshire, they found like 35 insects per piece of firewood. And not all of those were invasives, but you know, some of them were. So don't move firewood. Buy firewood at your destination if you can. Harvest it at the site if you can. Or if you do need to move firewood, buy certified heat treated firewood that has been heated to a federally mandated level that is known to be known to kill anything living in the tree, in the firewood. Other things you can do using native plants and pruning your trees when they're dormant is going to help very much for some diseases. And just keeping an eye on your trees for pests and diseases. I think that's it for me.
I had a couple questions, if that's all right.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
This is Deb. Thank you, Colleen, so much. That was really informative. And my first question is about the firewood. So I have a wood stove. I burn firewood. I get it from a local guy.
Perfect.
What about that? Is that okay?
Yeah, so we suggest that firewood ideally should not move more than about 50 miles from where it was grown. So that if there is some unknown infestation, it's not traveling long distances. You know, if your neighbor who's a local guy has an infestation and you move firewood and it sits in your yard, it hasn't gone very far. And yeah, absolutely, people burn firewood, they need to move firewood around, but if you can buy it locally, that's just so much better. You're just reducing the chances of starting an infestation.
Yeah, and I think he harvests all of his firewood fairly locally within that radius. So that's my first question. My second question is, how do you keep your spirits up? Because I mean, I'm just, you know, seeing all of these that you're going through, and you're not even going into all the details, and there's more that we haven't talked about. And so, you know, with globalization and how much we move around and sort of what a mess we've made by moving things around, what do you see in the long view for managing these continued distribution changes and non-native species and biological controls? I mean, the biological control stories that are positive is very hopeful, but I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I do try to keep a longer view of biological control. You know, I may not see the results, but I'm hopefully setting the stage for a long-term reestablishment of a balance that is somewhat close to what we now know as natural. That's why I get so excited about Winter Moth. It had such a good short, quick turnaround, and you know, that's one of those insects that we're actually seeing control within a few years of releasing the biocontrol. For the others, yeah, I have to take the long view. I have to say, even if I can't do anything perfectly, what I can do will hopefully help. If I could slow down the spread, and even for things like emerald ash borer, we got it so much later than so many of the other states. We've got way more tools now than other states did. We have the ability to slow down that spread. We don't find it everywhere. We've got better monitoring tools. We know more about biological control. We know a little bit more about sort of IPM, you know, using biological control, and maybe a little bit of targeted pesticide use to protect a few important trees for, you know, until the biological control gets up and running. So yeah, it is distressing. It's really, really distressing. And sometimes I feel like I'm like that little kid with his finger in the dike trying to hold back the ocean. And I know I can't, but I know I can help somewhat. And if I can make things a little bit better, slow down the spread, increase the chance or the make it a little bit sooner the time that the biological control will take effect and help bring back some of these species into our forest.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your service and all that you folks are doing to stay on top of these issues. It's very much appreciated.
Thanks. So we're not always staying on top, but we do try.
With what you have.
I guess I have a similar question to Deb. I'm a high school science teacher at Sanford, and I teach wildlife biology, and I'm always excited to share this with my students. I actually have an emerald ash borer in a preserved little thing, and I bring out this little tube. I don't know, it's about yay big, and they're like, oh, what is it? And I bring it out, and it's this tiny little, little tiny little beetle. And how can I, obviously surprising them with, we have issues here in Maine. We have invasive species. But these are the things that are being done. But in their shoes, it's very, and even in my shoes, like, what can I do besides taking pictures, but like, educating myself. But I think when I share these, we talk about biodiversity, and it's frustrating, being one single person here in Maine, or being a class in Maine, or being on a Zoom like this. But how can I give younger generations and even myself more tools or more ideas on how to be involved, or how to maybe boost our spirits and our hope that these will be okay in the future, I guess?
Our websites do have some resources. There are actually some resources online, and not necessarily within the Maine Forest Service's website, but there are resources for classes. Talking about it and just increasing awareness beyond just a select few who are interested in the forest. The more people that are aware of this, the more people that understand why it's important to not move firewood. It's not just one more stupid regulation the government is putting on us and they can't tell us what to do. But if they understand that firewood, you move firewood, you could bring in oak wilt, and that could be the end of oak trees in your favorite campground. So there are reasons for this. Probably just talking about it and educating people and having them talk to their friends. Just being aware of it. Awareness helps.
Yeah, I do nature journaling with my students, and I was nature journaling like a madman trying to get all this information down. But maybe I'll do like an invasive species nature journal, and I only have like an example of an ash borer. But is there like, I know we're on Zoom because COVID and whatnot, but is there in the future, maybe could we get together and actually see an emerald ash borer tree that's still standing? Because I've never seen, like, I've just seen pictures of it. The beech tree. I love seeing the beech trees, except for when I run them over when I'm cross country skiing, and I like almost fall flat on my face because they don't lose their leaves. It's like the ones that's like,
I know.
And now,
like, healthy beech tree is a thing of beauty. Yeah.
Right, in the winter. And so, is there a time that you guys are thinking about getting together with actual examples that, I mean, I would hope that we wouldn't be able to get all examples within like a half mile of walking, but live or dead or actual specimens?
That is certainly a possibility. We are spread so very thin in the entomology lab, but you could talk to, there are district foresters, and you can find out who the district forester is in your district, and they would be probably glad to talk to you. Where did you say your school was?
I'm down at Sanford, and I'm trying to think of where my book
Sanford. So yeah, you've definitely got emerald ash borer down there.
Yeah.
And Sanford, we've actually, and Alfred is one of the places where we've been releasing biological control. I dare not make any promises because my time is so very limited, but feel free to get in touch with me, and if I can, while I'm doing work down there, let you know, and if a class came out or something like that, you could go to Brothers Beach even at this time of year, I don't know where that is, how close that is to you, but you can see emerald ash borer everywhere there. You can see the woodpecker feeding, and some of those trees are almost just stripped of bark. The woodpeckers have been so heavy. So even if it might be a worthwhile field exercise just to go out and say, we haven't ever seen this before, but can we see it? And then if you see it there, you can take that search image with you to other places.
What was that location?
Given that you're that close.
What was the location of the? Was it
Brothers Beach, which is in Alfred on the lake there. It's a town-owned beach. There's a rail trail there, and I just walked on the rail trail, and there's a lot of emerald ash borer there.
Also, I think that looking for brown-tail moth nests might be a good thing for you to do with kids. It's
although
it's
you
easy.
are far enough down south in York County, the one place where we have not been finding brown-tail moth.
And Colleen, I'm with you. I can't go into the bushes. I can't mow the lawn. I get really bad. So I used to live in Harpswell and know very much.
Oh, Harpswell's bad.
I will show pictures all day long of them. I do not need to go out.
But in the winter, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, it's safe to go out in the winter.
You're safe to go out in the winter and cut them and dispose of them, and you won't have any adverse effects. So that could be.
If you're really sensitive, like for me, if I go out to a tree that has been heavily infested and has a lot of branches, I will gear up just because there will be residual hairs.
Yeah.
That could be stuck in the branches or the twigs or and so because I am so sensitive and just half a dozen hairs can make me miserable, I will put gloves on and probably a face mask just to catch the hairs so I'm not breathing them.
Also, I definitely recommend just reaching out to the conservation district that's local to you, York County, and see what they have to provide for educational outreach or anything like that. That's sort of what we're here for.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have mentioned that.
Oh no, it's okay. Yeah, everybody
is
stretched thin though, so I think it's good to just we're all doing our best.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for those questions. Also, someone mentioned that UMaine Extension has a lot of info for kids and adults on their websites. Got Pests is a great site as well that they mentioned. So thanks so much, Sarah, for that. Any other questions or comments? Just want to thank everybody for being here again. Really appreciate everybody being here.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you so much, Colleen. Yeah, I learned a lot.
I wish there wasn't so much to learn, but yeah.
I mean, but yeah, everything's changing, and so it's good for us all to stay informed. So yeah, thanks so much.